Welcome, everyone, to our webinar about the Floating Office Rotterdam. I'm Rachel Sengers. I am the chair of the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister City Committee. Today's lecture is by Albert Takashi Richters, an architect from Powerhouse Company, which is based in Rotterdam. Albert will talk about the innovative design of the Floating Office Rotterdam, which is being built for the Global Center on Adaptation. And that's an NGO that promotes solutions for adapting for the impacts of climate change. And I want to welcome all of you in today's live session. In the audience today, we have architecture students from Baltimore in the United States and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We have architecture firms and other attendees from both our regions, and we have other visitors from around the world. And a very special welcome to the students from Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning. In today's webinar, we will first have some introductory remarks, first from me and then from Cristina Murphy from Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning. Then Albert will talk for about an hour, and then after that, there will be about 15 minutes of discussion where Albert will respond to questions from the audience. And Jeremiah Ikoja, a graduate architecture student at Morgan State University, will moderate that Q&A session. Thank you so much, Jeremiah, for that. Before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister Cities relationship. The cities are sister cities since 1985. The mayors back then of the cities decided to become sister cities because both cities are port cities, and the port industries were moving away from the city center, and some of those industries were even moving overseas, and the cities needed to reimagine their city waterfront and the city's economy, and they wanted to learn from each other, and that learning continues to today. The sister city relationship is managed by the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister City Committee, and we are all volunteers. The committee is based in Baltimore, and we have some volunteers in the Netherlands that help us with our activities. We promote economic, cultural, educational, health, environmental, and other types of cooperation between the Baltimore and Rotterdam regions. In recent years, many of our projects have an environmental sustainability theme. And thanks to our collaborations now with Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning, we're also focusing on architecture and urban design these days. Now I will hand over the microphone to Cristina Murphy, faculty at Morgan State University School of Architecture. Thank you.
Collaboration with the Baltimore-Rotterdam Committee and Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning in Baltimore. Specifically, this second webinar ties into SAP graduate class, Architectural Technology, Building Materials, which recurrent themes include architecture as a product of culture, as a product of place, and material as an expression of an idea, and the relationship of buildings whole to a building whole to a detail. This course is motivated by a firm belief that architects must know and engage the age they are living in, to design and respect it within extreme appropriateness by explicitly engaging with society and culture, with material and construction methods as they evolve by the shift of human culture, desires, and artistic, scientific, industrial developments. Before handing over the floor to our speaker, please allow me to briefly introduce you to Albert. Albert Takashi Richters is Associate and Design Director at Powerhouse Company. He heads the concept team where initial design concepts are conceived. He has been involved in various competitions and large-scale urban strategies, such as the recently presented Codrico Master Plan for the Rijnhaven in Rotterdam. The Floating Office Rotterdam is within this master plan. Albert has been a design tutor at the TU Delft and currently is tutoring at the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Urban Design. Now, participants, after Albert's lecture, you're invited to address questions. Please do so by placing your questions for Albert into the Q&A option within in the window below you, located below you in the screen. They will be answered following the order of placement. Should any question not be answered during the length of this webinar, please visit Powerhouse Company webpage, where you can place your inquiries on the content of this lecture. Also, you're welcome to type general comments into the chat window, but please be aware that Albert and the panelists might not see them. At this point, all please turn off your video and audio, with the exception of Albert, our speaker, of course. Albert, please take it away.
So, hello, guys. Always still something to get used to, knowing that there's 100 plus people on the other side of the screen and not being able to see them. Nonetheless, of course, it gives us the opportunity to be doing this at a distance, which is great. So yeah, my name is Albert. I think I was introduced quite completely, if not too completely, by Cristina already. So thank you for that. Also, thanks on behalf of Powerhouse Company for inviting us to say a little bit about our work and talk about the floating office here in Rotterdam. Let me just double check. So I guess you see the slides switching. If not, I'll hear that. Yeah, so Vessel for Change, that's basically the kind of title or subtitle we gave to this lecture, or actually to the project in general. This is also how we put it on our website, because it's besides its meaning for the Global Center of Adaptation, I think it also has meaning for us as an office, and it has challenged us in various ways that I will explain further along. And I think that also has brought with it a sense of change with how we deal with our profession. So I think in many senses of the word, it's a very suitable slogan, you could say. So basically, this is our team at Powerhouse. Back in 2009, it was founded by Nanne de Rue, all the way to the left. Yeah, this is basically how the team looks at the moment. Not a huge amount of people, actually, if you see the body of work that we've been doing. But in general, like, it's first of all a great place to work at, where basically everybody and everybody's opinion is treated in an equal way, and whether you're a technician or a designer, everybody contributes pretty much equally to our process, and that's a very good place to work in. We started off with, or actually back when the office was just a handful of people. It all started with this villa here in Holland in the woods. And this villa, even though I'm not going to elaborate on it, it's actually the start of the philosophy of Powerhouse as a company that not only is about beauty and taste and design, but also about how you put it together. And this villa was actually the first of those projects where, in this case, Nanne de Rue was responsible for doing everything from designing to the draft, the drawings for the builders, and this is basically the project that got it all started. Since then, we've been working on all kind of quite interesting villas, quite interesting projects. But yeah, we've panned out, and our portfolio now also consists of inner city developments, high-rise residential towers, bespoke offices such as the headquarters of the ASICS company of Europe in Amsterdam, or near Amsterdam, where basically this project was conceived through in quite a fast way, but had to already take into account all kind of sustainability measures. And now it has been quite a successful project in terms of revisiting what work and what the workplace can mean. So in that sense, also a very good and interesting learning moment that garnered knowledge for the floating office in the future. We've been working on interiors as well for different firms. So basically, we slowly have panned out to have a very diverse portfolio in which basically everybody works not only on just the design, but all the way through to detailing and so on. Besides that, we also had the great opportunity to work on some icons in places around the globe, such as the Çanakkale Tower that actually I personally worked on back in 2014. This was done with a collaboration with a small architecture firm here in Rotterdam called International Design. To our surprise, we won this project somehow based on a very beautiful painting that was inspired basically by a painting of Çanakkale that the mayor had in his room. So Nana, with his smart thinking, basically thought, well, we basically have to present it as a painting, and then it will be a success. And so it came to happen. And it led to other kind of loops, not necessarily exactly based on that same philosophy, but we recently finished the Loop of Wisdom in China, which is actually a sort of information pavilion for a new neighborhood that is going to be built there that has to, in the future, also house sport facilities and education facilities. So these kind of icons have been also quite important in, let's say, flexing our muscles in terms of design and also seeing them be executed. Back here, we've also now recently won a project for a pavilion in The Hague for the forestry, and it kind of symbolizes somehow the ending of 2020, in which we've been kind of developing a lot of projects in timber. So this was one of them, but of course the floating office in Rotterdam is a timber building, and now we're working on a school in Tilburg, which is a completely timber structure building with timber interiors, but clad with natural stone on the outside, which is also for us something quite new. It's quite unexpected to have a timber structure with a stone cladding, and I think this is how we like to experiment in our office with these interesting combinations. So this would be, for instance, the interior, and then what I just showed you would be the outside. And then also we're working on a social housing project that is made in timber. It's basically a refurbishment of an old flat in a neighborhood in Rotterdam, where we basically are using timber to build on top of existing foundations. And here the main discovery basically is that timber is much lighter, obviously, than concrete or other known more conventional materials, and therefore you can reuse the foundations of a building to build a completely new housing plot on top of it, which conforms to all the standards of living, and then we basically do it together with a landscape designer, in which not only the living but also the landscape around it are completely integrated as a whole. So again, here there's a degree of experimentation going on, and as I mentioned, basically our last year has been quite dense with these timber structure buildings, and I think that's a very exciting chapter that we're now entering. Something that is also new to us, to be working with this very new material. Going back here, yeah, as I said, basically this whole team is we're all doing it together, and yeah, it basically consists of not only the designers, but we also have everything, all the draftsmen and all the engineers. We have them in-house. So apart from having, of course, advisors on board and consultants for the different technical aspects of building, we in the end make sure that all the shop drawings get made, and yeah, I think it's quite an amazing feat that we are able to do that, and it also keeps us basically on our toes. Yeah, vice versa, as an engineer or as an architect, to keep in mind the certain stages of a project and how these stages come together, basically in keeping with the philosophy that basically got it all started, as I said, way back when the Villa 1 was built, the white one we saw in the forest at the beginning. Anyway, moving on to to basically the project. I actually wanted to put the project in a much larger context. So we're now kind of going to be zooming out a lot and then zooming back in. I will get to details, don't worry. But I just wanted to start with, since we're talking about the sister cities, just wanted to start with a quick comparison of Baltimore and Rotterdam. And what I found quite interesting is that you see, if you look at the current cities now, you see somehow a similarity in atmospheres where the former harbors have turned into sort of recreational spaces, recreational places, symbolizing basically how the cities have grown, the harbor functions have developed and perhaps moved out or have shrunken or grown in a different way. And this brings with it a kind of renewed thinking of water and the city, and basically the heritage of the city, the history of the city, and how we deal with that and what that could mean within the city life. It's quite funny actually to see also in the past, basically how, somehow in the imagery, even though I have sadly not been in Baltimore, you can recognize definitely a sort of similarity in how, for instance, the harbor activities were much more integrated within the city and within city life, and later got replaced totally by city life and sort of recreational activities as the harbor moved out. So here you can see, for instance, in Rotterdam, how it was completely interwoven, of course on a much smaller scale, but still there was much more sense of basically harbor and living as a unity somehow. And then nowadays we see how former heritage is then repurposed for more event-like activities or leisure activities, such as these two examples. On the right, you see the Hotel New York of Rotterdam, which was the former kind of like starting point or the end point, if you will, of the Holland America line, the cruise ship that ran through between New York and Holland in the last century. And again, here you see this sort of same atmosphere taking place. And to my surprise, even the water taxis have looked very similar, actually, which is interesting as well. So moving back here, Rotterdam was much smaller back in the day. And if you overlay it with Rotterdam now, basically on the top left corner of the old map, you find the central station. And then this twisting Maas River running along the south side of the old center, which is basically now completely part of the city. And if you basically kind of zoom out further, you find basically that the city has grown quite considerably to the south. So, and basically what that means is the harbors that used to be part of the city that have been now embodied by the city that I've just shown in images, they are much smaller actually than the harbors that you see now. For instance, on the lower part of the screen, you see two kind of big basins. One of them is called the Rijnhaven, the northern one, which is this following image here. So to your left, you see the Rijnhaven, and this is basically the location of the floating office that I'm going to discuss. And basically what is important about the Rijnhaven is that it's actually along an axis of city developments. As I mentioned, the city grew all the way down to the south. And the south actually, in terms of amount of residents, is much larger than the north side. And it has its own center, but they have not necessarily been connected that well, obviously because of the huge river and the water and the harbor functions in between that actually have only moved out quite recently. But so now the city has this vision, the so-called high-rise vision, that is trying to tie the north and the south together. And what that means is that the Rijnhaven, as you can see, kind of located right in the center of your screen, becomes a new center in itself and becomes a new place, a new development within the tissue of Rotterdam. But looking at it on the grand scope of things, you see that the municipality of Rotterdam is enormous. So like this image that I just showed you is where you see the Rijnhaven right there. is basically, again, if you see the evolution of the harbor over time, it's quite minuscule. You could say it's like more than 30 kilometers across from east to west, and the harbor function still remains there. And I would say that there is, in that sense, a contrast with Baltimore, from what I can gather, that the harbor of Rotterdam still is very much in function. It's still very much happening. And it's even growing, and it's trying to, even though it's not anymore the largest harbor of the world, it's still trying to profile itself as the most high-tech harbor, the most innovative harbor. At the same time, still having this relationship with the old city, and the old city still having to deal somehow with traffic that goes back and forth from the freight terminal. So obviously the freight gets transferred to smaller ships, to river ships, and still the mass is very much and very intensely used for the harbor function in the end. And that's, I think, something that is a bit different when it comes to Baltimore, because basically this whole mass is a very long river that still has to function as an important port. And at the same time, there's this whole sense and this whole movement of how the city should basically be much more, first of all, it should deal with the local ecology. As the harbor grows, there's more questions about how the harbor deals with water, how the harbor deals with nature. And at the same time, as the harbor moves out of the city, there's also a lot of question about what do we do with these remaining harbor functions, or the remaining basins that now become new spaces for living, new spaces for recreation, and obviously new spaces for nature. And not only in the kind of green and recreational sense, but obviously also in the sense of the climate change, climate adaptation. So all these themes, of course, become very relevant when you look at the bigger picture of the city of Rotterdam, when we kind of zoom into the floating office. So going back to Rijnhaven, as I mentioned, Rijnhaven is the one right left bottom of the screen, and Rijnhaven itself also has had its own fair share of change. It used to be just land. It used to be a polder landscape, as you can see, basically pretty much up until 1895, and then in the 1900s they dug out this basin, which was pretty much the first big basin of the Rotterdam harbor. So as basically trade and freight got bigger, boats got bigger, and they needed bigger basins, and that led, for instance, to the Rijnhaven as being one of the first big ones. And since then, the Rijnhaven has pretty much remained the same. But what is interesting about it is somehow that it's not a basin with parallel quays. It actually has this sort of a different shape to it, and as you could see in the previous image, this different shape where you do not have like a sort of parallel sides make it a very interesting space, actually, as an urban space. And somehow with the new innovations and with the new ambitions of the city, not only to grow south, but also to integrate nature, integrate city life into this new zone. The Rijnhaven is actually a very, very interesting space, because it's not only a new scale for the city to actually encroach onto the former harbor function, but it's also basically a new testing ground somehow. And that's how this whole GCA, somehow the floating office, fits in. At the same time, it has also been a place of innovation for a long time. So after it was dug out, it basically was the first electrically driven harbor in Rotterdam, which was, or actually in Europe, which was already an innovation. And nowadays, of course, there's a lot of new things happening around the Rijnhaven already. You probably might have heard of the Kop van Zuid Peninsula, which is the one basically opposite of the city center on the north side. And this peninsula with various new firms such as MBRDV, but also Alvaro Siza with the kind of brownish building in the middle, and Meccano have been working there. And behind there, in this second layer, you see the Rotterdam of OMA. Renzo Piano is there. So this was a sort of first master plan of Rotterdam that had like large-scale development take place in what used to be a former harbor function, and it's still moving further. And yeah, this started in the 90s, this development, and something that was maybe less taken into account here was how to deal with this large scale in regard to the tissue on the ground and what happens on the ground floor levels and the urban life. Since it was a completely new frontier for the city, you see that there was there was a lot of architectural experimentation, but there was not necessarily this good connection with what is happening on the ground floor. And that's something that is now starting to change on the other side of the Rijnhaven, where you have, for instance, the Phoenix Lofts, that have been built on top of an old, basically storage building, where in kind of the development of the project, there has been much more attention to not only just first building a huge amount of housing and then thinking about the public space, but doing that all together. And so you see also how this area in itself, even though it maybe is not yet a fully fledged center of Rotterdam, already is a place where these new experiments are taking place and where these new investigations are taking place in practice on how to deal with city development as a whole. So when we go to the Código and the Rijnhaven, we actually are dealing with three parallel events that in the end somehow led to the floating office taking place. There's the master plan for Rijnhaven, which basically comes out of what I've been showing you more or less. Then there is the ambition of the Global Climate Adaptation Center. And then there is the Código vision, which I'll expand. And they kind of all are set on a timeline. There was this master plan that was thought about for the Rijnhaven a long time ago, back in 2013. There was a kind of framework set up that then ended up in a master plan. And in 2017, Rotterdam, together with Groningen, won the bid to put the Global Adaptation Center for Adaptation in the Rijnhaven. And Rotterdam promised them to have a floating office. So basically you see that that given was already there from the very beginning. And at the same time, Powerhouse Company, we were working on a city development plan, a vision for a so-called factory called the Código factory. And this is these are the three components that that happened for this project to take place. With the Adaptation Center having its deadline this year. Actually, it was last year, but because of the Corona situation, it was extended. But basically, the whole idea was to open the building during the Global Climate Summit that took place a month ago, basically. So the deadline was quite soon after the Rotterdam won the bid. I'm not going to read this text for you, it's a Dutch text, but basically what it's saying for the Rotterdam master plan is that the master plan was about not basically telling developers what to do and where, but more explaining them that there should be a framework that is supported by the municipality and by the different needs of the municipality, more as a framework rather than a sort of fixed set of rules. And this framework was there back in 2013 already. But what is important about this is that, as you can see, sort of like under the hatched area, you see this sort of old factory building that I'm going to talk about yet later. And this factory building is still in function, which means that a lot of development happening in the Rijnhaven could not yet happen. And in fact, still is somehow blocked by the fact that the factory is a harbor function. So Rotterdam has this has to deal with the harbor company And the harbor company has certain rights when there's a harbor function. This factory is the last remaining harbor function, which is basically blocking a lot of development. But the ambitions for this place, as I mentioned, are huge, are large, and are about making it part of the city again. So how does that happen when there is this one factory that kind of blocks development through, because it's still functioning as a harbor function? That's kind of where somehow the situation now is, but where we also kind of played a role. So as you see here, this is the final master plan that was presented last year for the Rijnhaven, quite ambitious. It follows this whole idea of coming closer to the water, integrating nature and making for a livable space surrounding the harbor. And also, of course, being able to add quite large-scale developments surrounding it, in a way also to deal with the need, quite stringent need for housing in the city. Then there's the GCA, as I mentioned. The GCA, as was already explained by Rachel, is the Global Center on Adaptation. Was initially started by Ban Ki-moon. It was a result of a collaboration with the Dutch government and the United Nations during the Paris Climate Summit, where the Netherlands decided to initiate the Center of Adaptation, formerly known as the Global Center of Excellence on Climate Adaptation. Last month they did a climate summit, but basically they have these 5 ambitions where they want to have cities work together to exchange knowledge, cities around the world, and they do it with lots of partners, and they have research papers, and basically it's sort of a knowledge sharing center where solutions or problems are measured and dealt with through this sort of central headquarters. And at the same time, they try to find partners, financial partners, but also governmental partners to, around the globe, create a network in which climate adaptation or resilience is put on the agenda as much as possible in policies and all kind of stuff. So quite in a way, it makes therefore a lot of sense that somehow Rotterdam did this bid to attract them to the city, following what I just explained, basically when it comes to resilience, nature, and so on. And they basically won the bid together with Groningen, which has the Energy Academy of Europe, which is more of a research-based center where innovation takes place and research takes place in terms of adaptation strategies. So together they won this bid, but they also got the promise of having or getting a floating office in Rotterdam. And then there's Codrico, which I mentioned before. That's this factory. And it's actually another master plan within the master plan, a vision that we have been working on as Powerhouse. And it consists of this one remaining factory that is still happening, that is still in function. It is basically a factory that does all kind of stuff with corn, for cereals, for pet food, all kind of uses for corn. You wouldn't expect it to be that case, but this factory is quite high tech on the inside. But as you can see, it is quite an old structure. It actually comes all the way back from the 1930s, if I'm correct. Part of it is actually even a listed monument. And then slowly it has been kind of expanding as a factory. And the fact that it's a monument also means that it's something that has to be preserved and that has to be taken seriously as a building, because as you can see, it's a very kind of iconic building and has an iconic presence in this harbor. So we've been working on this master plan. I will not go through the details, but we've been working on it basically since 2017, so already for over 3 years. And as I mentioned, it's the one remaining factory that will kind of fulfill the ambitions of the municipality of being able to have this sort of promenade surrounding this harbor and making it therefore really an integrated part of the city. And so they needed to come up with a strategy in which the factory could move out in order to unlock the full potential of the Rijnhaven. And we worked on that development, which is somehow also a new frontier where an old part of Rotterdam is going to be part of the city again, a part of Rotterdam in the south of the Maas that actually expanded hugely the moment that Rijnhaven became dug out. It was, for instance, the first settlement of the biggest settlement of Chinese in Europe in the beginning of the previous century. And it has basically an old center, but it also was placed right next to quite heavy industry. And this is what the vision now looks like after we also played a role in it. So pretty much in the center of the screen, you see the Codico master plan that you see here in the model. But so how does this connect with the floating office, you might think, because I'm really kind of dodging the bullet, it might seem, but basically this is the issue. So we've been working very closely with the municipality. We've been having many workshops with them throughout these past years for the Codico development. And in so doing, we've kind of gotten a good feeling of the ambitions of the municipality, what the municipality is looking for. And basically, since we've been in close contact with them for this development, it has basically strengthened our network with the city. But this network actually is held together not by architects, we wish. Actually, it's held together by the developers. And you might notice that one guy there is Nanne de Rue, whom I mentioned before. And so he started a Red Company together with Niels Janssen a few years ago, a very young development company with huge ambitions. And they basically are, yeah, you could say the combination of Nanne and Niels is on one hand, both are amazing strategists, but let's say you would have the networker and the quant, and both together are basically a force to be reckoned with now in Rotterdam. They're developing they're the largest developer on paper now in the city of Rotterdam, developing huge projects, one of which, of course, is Codico. But because they actually are holding all these projects together, they've also built a good network of investors and a good relationship with the city of Rotterdam. And since basically Rotterdam is dealing with this deadline for which they didn't have really a design yet, Red Company together with Powerhouse Company is basically the team to go to, because we know how to get things done in a very, very short amount of time. And we know how to line up everybody in a very, very short amount of time in order to fulfill this project. So that is actually what finally led to the development of the floating office. Sorry, I'm flipping a bit back and forth. So that brings us to the floating office itself. And here you kind of see how the floating office is attached to this green boulevard, which also is going to be floating. So this is a first impression of how the city is sort of coming onto the water, where the height difference between the quay, which is now fluctuating between sometimes 4 meters, between let's say 2 and 4 meters, is now becoming much more tangible, somehow much more reachable because of floating structures around the Rijnhaven, with which you can basically kind of sit on the edge and touch the water. Something that is very difficult, has proven to be very difficult in Rotterdam, and something that somehow is very needed within this bigger vision. So here you see the first impression, but it actually all started somehow like this. And I think the fact that that this whole project somehow for a large part is being kind of motored by all kind of external forces says a lot about this first sketch, because there was one of the Codico meetings that was there, I think now 1.5 years ago, the first meeting, we had already a couple of workshops about Codico and for Codico for this big development happening opposite of the floating office. And it actually appeared to be the right moment to propose something for a floating office. And I was literally asked 15 minutes before Nana had to leave to the meeting to draw up some kind of concept. I thought of an island with some wood structure on it that would maybe be a bit modular, and that's basically what this sketch is. It's really not more than that. It's probably very inefficient to build and all this kind of thing. But we sent this like as a sort of appendix to this meeting, and it was the first trigger actually for them to say, okay, well let's give it a go with Powerhouse and let's see what they can actually make of it. But I think if you see the next slide, which is a completely different proposal, which was the follow-up proposal of this, you notice actually that the architect part is not yet the most essential part of this huge kind of culmination of forces, basically. As you can see, it could have been this, it could have been that. They would have been happy with it. And it all comes down to schedule, it all comes down to organization, and it all comes down to trust of the organization to make something happen. And whether it's this design or the other design, that in the end, at this stage, didn't really play a role. And that's why we could come up with something completely different, such as this, and they would still be kind of happy with it. The reason we came up with this is because we had to actually get it floated into the Rijnhaven. And it's quite funny that this process went so fast that we only had a few initial sketches for this. Like these were sketches that were drawn up very fast to just kind of set the base, the basic idea for the concept, for the design. But it actually is at the core of what became the floating office in the end. So here you see the necessity to be able to float the building in and out of the harbor, and that has to do with the fact that the agreement with the municipality is that this is a temporary building that it will not necessarily remain in the harbor for an extended period of time, but let's say for now it's a 10-year period. But it also, since it was floating anyway, and since it had to be a floating office, we needed to be able to transport it. But thinking further on that note, you see that it's basically being placed on old steel barges. And so the whole idea back then was to basically make a kind of foundation of old push barges that are being used by the shipping industry at the moment, and then use that as a foundation. But that dictated a lot for the design, in the sense that, of course, these push barges, they have certain dimensions, certain standard sizes, and so on. So that kind of, you could say, was maybe a sort of clumsy first or a naive first thought of how we could deal with this floating structure. In the end, this is what it looked like, and as you can see, it felt like a longhouse, a wooden longhouse, light structure on top of this big terrace. And in it, you already find some concepts that then in the further development of the design took place. So what you see, for instance, is the length, obviously, so that it could pass through the bridge. That's a given. We see on top, on the roof, we see the idea of having solar panels. That's actually the main reason to pitch the roof, not only to give it a friendly presence, but also it helped us angle the roof towards the south sun. And we wanted to have that roof as a sort of full solar panel, edge to edge. So those are initial ambitions, as well as the tapering of the floors. You can see also in the elevation, floors tapering out. So the farther away you are from the public spaces, the more balcony you have, so to speak. And at the same time, the balconies help to control somehow the climate within. Since it's quite a glazed building, something that you already saw, for instance, when I showed the ASICS headquarters, the fact that basically we wanted a very light, transparent, and open building that needed to deal, of course, with sunlight and so on. And back then we had this sort of interesting roof shape. We thought that the roof shape was the iconic part of it. The roof shape had to be this sort of slick and kind of high-tech wing. Those were sort of initial ideas that we were thinking of back then. Not a lot of columns, as you can see, huge spans, but also a little bit random, you could say. And this you can see also when you look at the design that this, there's many things going on, and maybe you don't see it yet because this is the first impression, but I definitely see it. And as we go further, you will see how this design evolved in order to become kind of stronger in its presence. But we were looking for something, even though it was floating, we wanted to look for something elegant, something that had a very representative presence to it, obviously, since it was going to be the headquarters of this very representative organization. But one of the things that we really always came back to, and I think this is one of the inspirations, this is the house along the party wall by Herzog and de Meuron, was that using wood, and maybe also because it's one of our first projects in wood, we wanted to really explore how to make this wood really be the star of the show and make it really the defining element for the building. Somehow also making sure that the fact and the way that it's put together is very visible, but still elegant. And I think this is one of the references that came along during the process of design thinking, where we thought that this kind of putting together of elements was a very important aspect for building. And in thinking further on that, you will see that basically because of that, the design slowly evolved. So here I show you a previous design where we have this sort of sleek roof. I already mentioned it was a bit random, and we actually thought, well, let's really bring it down to its core elements, where we talk about a frame of wood and glass in between. And basically it led to this design iteration, in which this frame would be sort of this super grid on 3 floors that would be very emphasized, not only on the inside, but also on the outside, still maintaining within it the whole, basically the concept that we initially had of this long, elegant gesture. And then if you compare it like where we started, if you see the evolution, you see how much, at least that's how I think of it, but I'm really curious to know how you see it, if you see the same. But you see how much stronger actually the design got. Obviously, there's a change in the render styles here, so we should look a bit past that. But I think nonetheless, I think the presence got much stronger because we kind of brought it down to its elements. And then you basically see how this translates into a 6x6 grid on the interior, where it might not be the most conventional office interior, but it does give a lot of first of all, it gives a lot of neutrality to the space, and secondly, it also because it's so neutral, it allows for many different uses. I'm afraid maybe the lines are not that clear on the screen, but basically the grid also allows for somehow a nice space and elegant space, and it allows for flexibility. But also because it's slightly bigger than, let's say, your conventional office grid, it feels also more generous. The funny thing is that around that time, I had actually had a school trip for TU Delft to Vienna as a tutor. And we went to Vienna, and this was the first time for me to get into this the tiny Loos bar, the American bar in the center of Vienna by Adolf Loos, where basically it's a bar of 4 by 6 meters, basically, literally, and that's all you see. But it seems much larger because he has finished the top half of the walls with mirrors, and in a very intelligent way has placed this grid structure made out of natural stone and marble. It's really quite spectacular over this very small space, and the effect it gives is amazing when you feel that it's this little cube in a matrix, sort of infinite grid that makes the space feel so much larger. And somehow, even though our building is completely different, it's funny to see that this, like the moment I experienced this space, I really felt also super convinced about using this grid also in our building, even though it was a completely different purpose, even though it was a completely different situation, even though it's not introvert at all. Just the fact that this grid was so strong here, yeah, it kind of gave you the confidence to go for it, you know, also in a building. And it's funny that these two events, this school trip versus this design process went together in that moment. Here you see a little bit more of it. Details have changed over time. You will see it also later on. But basically, this is how the building has evolved. And what you see also is the use of symmetry. And symmetry is a thing that, of course, happens not necessarily from an aesthetic point of view in this case, but definitely from a point of view of the fact that it floats. So the moment like you are not, the weight is not distributed evenly or symmetrically, then you have a lot of technical issues to deal with when it comes to the weight and how the building floats. Of course, we don't want a slanted building, so that means you would need to add ballast, but then the ballast is actually dead weight that you don't really use. So symmetry was always actually not only an aesthetic choice, but it made sense as well somehow for this particular purpose. Here we see some details, and here basically you see the section of a floating foundation of concrete with on top the grid structure. So I mentioned concrete now, where I previously mentioned steel barges. I also mentioned, of course, that the steel barges were difficult to use because you need to maintain them. They need to be pulled up onto the shore every few years for inspection. And obviously, if you're using second-hand ones, it's never guaranteed that they will actually be proper enough to hold such an important building. So with a little bit of pain in our hearts, we decided to go for concrete, but we also discovered that concrete had a lot of potential in terms of climate management for the building. So these concrete barges that I will soon show you in a video have in them integrated like a whole sort of tubing system that makes sure that the temperature of the water is transferred into the cooling of the building. And therefore can cool the office functions. And with offices, the heating load is usually much higher than the cooling, the temperature load of cold air, because basically you've got computers, you've got people there, and that's why cooling is much more important. When you look at the yearly schedule, cooling of the building is much more important, and therefore it was made a lot of sense to use these this concrete foundation as a basically a heat exchange for the building, and that's what you see here. And basically, this in combination with the timber, which is produced completely sustainably in Germany, and then built actually on site. It's prefabricated in elements and then put on site. In combination with a vast amount of solar panels, makes it a completely energy neutral and CO2 neutral structure, as well as having a very friendly, warm presence seen from the water side. And then again, here we have a kind of a basic sketch of how we were thinking of putting these elements together, where you have a sort of core structure. And then on the core structure, you make basically windows with bespoke frames that you then clamp with sort of facade elements, cladding onto that structure. And we wanted to keep it that simple. And in the end, you'll see that we managed to do it like that. And this is one of those detailed drawings that I made way back when we were thinking of how do we think of these details, and how do we think of putting the building together. And here you see the scheme again of all these layers stacked on top of each other, on top of this basically this sort of terrace that arrives at the water, making it in a way quite a presence on the water, but at the same time being still somehow this island where you can have this much closer relationship with the water, on top of the fact that when you work there, you still can go outside of every floor, walk around the whole building. That makes it a very friendly and welcoming building. And on the interior, you also see how this grid actually translates into this sort of frame that has within it these modules, these ceiling modules that integrate everything from lighting to cooling to heating. Everything is in there to keep it very elemental and clean somehow. And then when you're on the top floor office space, it becomes a sort of very generous space, very representative as well. And what we were looking also for in the interior is that instead of actually, I think one of the interesting discussions we had when it came to the interior is, do we have tables that come at up and down for people that want to work standing or sitting? Or do we work smartly with the spaces in which we create variations of spaces where you can actually move to when you're working on a laptop, and where you can actually either work on a standing table or sit in a sort of cafe atmosphere, or, so we kind of were rethinking this in a way of being sort of down to earth about what work means in such a building, rather than kind of being very focusing on gadgets and things that actually are only solving minor solutions to basically what it means to be working in a space like this. So I think that's an interesting given about the workspace. So last part, the building itself. It's getting built now. So we started this end of 2019, and now basically the building is already quite advanced, as you will see. And it came with a degree of tension because, as I mentioned, we needed to get this this office, this floating island, you could say, in the Rijnhaven. So I'll show you a little clip here of how that went. I suppose you'll hear the sound. Amsterdam, basically. Have to go through docks. Probably the most measured dimension ever. Make sure that it's properly. And as you can see, once it came in, the building could start. And here you see how the first elements are being put in place. I mentioned that the wood structure was prefabricated offsite and then transported to, basically to the Rijnhaven, and then hoisted in by cranes. And what is, what I want to mention is that this building method is also a kind of novel method that was invented actually somehow, or was named by Nanne de Rue as the HelloFresh model. I'm not so sure if you guys have HelloFresh in America, but I believe that Blue Apron is an equivalent of that. I'll try to explain. So basically, usually when a building is built, you, as an architect, we provide the drawings to a contractor, and the contractor just puts it together. But always looks for the cheapest just to fit in the budget and to actually increase their own profit margins. What the HelloFresh model does is basically says, okay, these are the ingredients. They're all already arranged. The woodwork is arranged. The glass So the window providers are there. The installation guys are all lined up. Everything is lined up. The contractor just has to make sure that they put it together and does not negotiate anything, because the whole ambition behind this HelloFresh method is to basically make sure that the quality and the standard of building is kept at the standard that is required and wanted by the client, the developer, and so on. So basically all the ingredients are put into a box, all the building materials are all set, all the companies that have to provide the different parts of the building are already lined up beforehand. And what you get then is basically shop drawings where, in this case, they've been color coded just to make it a bit clear, where each sort of subcontractor, be it the wood or the facade, have their own bespoke drawings. So they know exactly what to build where and how it relates to the other contractors. And this is how you see it came together for the floating office. And what I think is quite fascinating about this, even though I have not been in depth involved in this part of the process, since I'm much more in the beginning, is the very clear sort of line, the clear lines literally, physically, between the one and the other discipline somehow. And how basically coming from this sort of elemental approach of the building, where everything is reduced to very somehow rigid, but at the same time neutral grid, we managed to keep also the building process clear and simple, and therefore not only make it efficient, but somehow in it there is a very something very elegant that takes place. Here you see, for instance, the corner detail where the woodwork that is done in blue has already been defined in terms of where you have to cut the corner and how the facade is going to be clamped along it. You see, for instance, on the left-hand side, the bottom left, you see the window frame, which is 6x3 prefabricated window frame that is basically clamped in against the wood structure, and then on top of it comes the cladding. This is actually somehow the advanced detail, obviously, of the first sort of scheme that I was showing you, that was about how we wanted to put things together. And I think it's very interesting to see how these different subcontractors come together in this in a very kind of clear sense. You see it in all these drawings in a similar way. Here you see basically also how it's put on the concrete. This is a roof detail. And all colors have their own discipline somehow. You can also see a little detail here in which, for the wood structure, the gap for the blinds was already made, prefabricated, already defined all the way at the beginning, so that once it's put on site, the gaps along the window are already there to be able to place the blinds, which are essential not only for the sun, but essential for keeping the climate of the office basically stable. For instance, during the nighttime, when people leave the office tends to cool down. So then when you bring down those blinds, you retain heat. And basically all of this is kind of like all works together in an integrated way. And then you see here the section that came out of that. What you, for instance, notice is all these holes in the beams. These are not meant structurally. Obviously, the beams are structural, but the holes actually are meant to give like flexibility for the installation, the tubings and the ducts that have to make sure that they that the ceilings that I just showed, this modular ceiling, is all connected to the cores. We had to deal with, of course, constraints in terms of width and height. As I showed you, the bridge was a very important element, and therefore we couldn't go too high, we couldn't go too wide. But of course, we wanted to retain generous spaces in the floors. So what was important to us is to be able to integrate somehow all these installations into the structure, usually you would have the structure and then the installation guy would come in and say, well, we need ducts of this dimension, and we'll just hang them under the structure, and then underneath you will put a ceiling. But of course we wanted to leave the structure exposed, and we didn't want such thick floor packages. So we needed them to work together from the get-go. Actually, the structural engineer and the installation advisor, they had to work together to integrate both, because the conventional ducts would never fit within these beams if they were like singular ducts, the ones that you would normally have. So the ducting had to be divided along pipes. And then as you see, as the building gets built, it's a lot of handwork in the end. And you see how basically everybody on site, using relatively small cranes, is able to hoist and lift all these quite big pieces of wood. In the end, as I mentioned, for one of the earlier projects, the social housing block, wood is a relatively light building material, so it can be manhandled quite easily. And here you see the detail of how the glass is basically just put against the structure and then later sealed with the facade elements. We have, as you can see, these are 6x3 panes of glass, more or less. They're quite spectacular because basically from the inside you get this unobstructed view, frameless view. The frame is basically integrated and hidden behind the structure. And here you see basically the drawings of how the installations are being run through the relatively small holes. So it's a very unconventional way to divide all your ducting and distribute it throughout the building. But at the same time, you see also how tight the details can become between a beam and a column, or two beams in a column in this case, by having these sort of steel connection points that are completely hidden within the wood structure. That was it, but I'd like to close off with a final video. This was a video that was presented. Sadly, the building could not be officially opened yet. Hopefully that will happen later on this year. But as I mentioned, the 2021 deadline is still there, and we're definitely going to make it. But this video was made 1 month ago for the climate summit that had to take place actually fully online. So here, Nanne de Rue is talking about the building and how what it means and how it's been put together. I wanted to show this as a sort of closing for the presentation. Wait 1 second. Oops. It all went so well. Anyway, here it is.
How do we make an office building that can adapt to climate change? And how do we make a building that is energy self-sufficient and carbon neutral? The Global Center on Adaptation, the GCA, is an international organization working on accelerating climate adaptation. The GCA fulfills this role worldwide from its regional offices in various countries, and also from its new headquarters in Rotterdam. For that, we are making a new type of building. The new headquarters of the GCA floats on the water in the harbor area of Rotterdam, adapting to changing sea levels. It is energy neutral and is built entirely out of timber. It generates its own energy through solar panels and receives its cooling from the water of the harbor. It is a building ready for the circular economy. And it represents how Rotterdam tackles the climate challenges with bold ideas and with cooperation between citizens, governments, and businesses. We made a building that represents our ideals for a climate adaptive future, and we named it Floating Office Rotterdam. Floating Office Rotterdam aims to be an icon of resilience by design, matching the ambitions of its hometown, Rotterdam. It is a proof that we can do things differently today, when we push the boundaries of what we know and what we can. Floating Office Rotterdam, welcoming a circular, sustainable and adaptive future.
So that was it. Thanks a lot. I think I have to open the slide to open the Q&A session. Give me 1 sec. And I guess...
Yeah, Albert,
yeah.
don't worry. We are going to take care of the Q&A.
All right, cool.
Thank you very much, Albert, for this mind-blowing presentation. Go Powerhouse Company. Albert, please keep on your screen sharing your presentation so you can keep on, moving up and down if necessary.
Sure. I'll go back to the screen share. 1 sec.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bring it back to Keynote. Yeah, you will see the Keynote screen right now. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll keep it like this so I can easily scroll up and down. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit hard.
That is fantastic. I would like to make a little announcement that the lecture will run slightly later than originally planned to allow enough time for Q&A, if that is okay for everybody. Students and all attendees, well, I think they are on it. Please, you're all invited to share your questions in the Q&A window and share all your concern in the chat window, of course. At this point, I would like to invite Jeremiah to go ahead and share the collected questions with Albert and the panelists at this point. Thank you so much.
Okay, the first question comes from a participant stating, would it be possible to hear a little bit about the timber structure and the floating foundation? How is it designed to float? If there is a specific species of wood chosen, how the timber is protected from climate and moisture?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. I mean, first of all, it's cross-laminated timber, which is basically, usually it's pine wood. It's grown in the forests in Germany. What is quite an interesting fact about this is if you would so pine wood can grow quite fast, and what it means is that if you would count all the forests of Germany together, then the amount of wood necessary for the timber office would grow back within half an hour, basically. So every tree in Germany is growing little by little, or at least every tree purposed for the building industry is growing little by little currently as we speak. And yeah, basically you have the same amount of timber within that short amount of time. That's a very interesting given. It also means that that mass of timber stores within it an equivalent of 8 million driven kilometers of an average car. So that's basically what we're talking about when we talk about timber structure, that it has enormous advantages. And it basically, even though the foundation is made out of concrete, it still manages to offset the CO2 load of the concrete that is there. And then the second, the question regarding the foundation, basically it's concrete. It's basically the law of Archimedes. So you have to make watertight concrete, and you make sure that there's enough volume that displaces enough water, and therefore you float. So in that sense, it doesn't have to do a lot with the weight. It has to do with how much volume of water is displaced, and if that volume is equivalent to the weight of the building, basically you float. So that's how the foundation works. In a sense, there's no rocket science there, but I think that's somehow how the project can be represented. I mean, it's sort of staying down to earth, not only because it has to be built efficiently and fast, but also because keeping it down to earth also makes for somehow an elegant solution to everything. And I feel that it happens in all aspects of the building, whether it's the design or the detail or the choices we made in terms of material. It all kind of comes down to staying down to earth, and it doesn't necessarily have to be super high tech for that. Regarding the water, if you look at this detail, originally we had this sort of detail where we would accentuate the beams coming out as if they were cut, and then they would be covered by sort of a galvanized panel. But if you look closely at the final, look for that here. Yeah, here you can see it basically. So First of all the beams are treated with sort of gray wash, you could say. So we decided to give it a sort of grayish tone, and this paint makes sure that it is weatherproof. And as you can see here, the detail of this sort of the columns being let's say conceptually cut is not the case anymore. The floor extends a little bit further over the beams, and therefore the beams are protected enough from the weather. Another advantage, of course, is like if you decide to cover it, as I just showed you, then you have all kind of other issues when you cover it, because then it's the moisture that kind of stays between the metal and the beam that really starts to cause problems. Whereas when you leave the beam, even though it might be exposed to rain and wind and might get wet, the fact that it's exposed makes sure that it remains basically ventilated, and therefore the moisture cannot seep into the wood. So this is how we solve that part.
Okay. The next question is from a participant. They state, thanks for a great presentation. The question is, did you study about life cycle assessment of wood due to relative humidity of the area?
Ooh. Well, there are all kind of life cycle assessments made by basically the engineers that are involved in the project. I personally have not done such a thing. So, there's definitely something that is, as I mentioned in the previous answer, we do these assessments and these tests to see to what extent basically, what is the load environmentally of the use of these materials, but also, I mean, the whole idea of building in this modular fashion, because everything is repetitive. The beams are all repetitive, the windows are repetitive, the grid is all clear grid. It's also meant to be unscrewed, and basically you can recycle every component of the building somehow. So in that sense, the life cycle is extended, but the building is anyway meant to be and perform up to the standards for at least 30 years. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, if you want precise numbers, I would have to refer you to our project architect, but we do these life cycle assessments come along the way, and also it's sort of information that we keep tabs on along the process, obviously to also learn. You know, as I said, this is one of our first projects in timber, quite an ambitious one, because it's not only just on the ground, but it floats. So this is something that we want to learn from as well.
The next question is, are roof and floor elements also timber?
Mm-hmm. Well, the floor is covered. Basically, the ground floor is covered by a layer of concrete, and of course, you need to finish the floor. So in the end, the floor will be finished with thin concrete and carpeting. But basically, all the floors, roofs, everything is made out of timber. You can see it basically here. The blue color is all basically wood. It's all cross-laminated, as you can see. So yeah, full timber, as well as here in this picture, you can see it.
Okay. The next question is, can you talk about how the concrete interacts with the sea, and how it, if at all, the concrete is treated on the sea facing sides?
The sea. Well, I mean, I guess you talk about the sea in terms of the fact that this is indeed a tidal water. So obviously the building will be going up and down with the tides. I think with the lunar tide, the difference can be up to 2.5 meters, I believe. But on average, on a daily basis, the building goes up and down 120, I think, 1.20 meters. I don't know what that is in inches or feet, so you'll have to look that up. But let's say it's 1.20 meters going up and down. The concrete is basically made water. It's waterproof concrete. The water itself is not fully salinated. It's brackish water, because it's basically where the sea. Rotterdam is located in an area where the seawater and river water come together. So in terms of like salt, I don't know the precise details, but that doesn't seem to have a great effect on the concrete basins.
Okay, I have two questions from this participant. I can read it out both to you, and I can go back if you need to.
Sure.
The first one is currently we are going through an energy transition, and I was wondering if the master plan for Rijnhaven also consists of a local resource, electricity, heating, etc., sharing systems in which the buildings are not only connected spaciously, the floating boulevard, but also connected to share resources and residual flows. For instance, excess energy from the solar panels for a greater benefit for the whole neighborhood. And the next question is, I noticed a structural wood that holds the floor slash roof, and the rendering is gray slash white. You mentioned that the design idea was to really show the structural to its core. So I was wondering why the aesthetics of the structure was not shown more as a rough timber to create awareness on that it actually is timber.
Okay, two good questions. The first one is quite a big question. Yeah, so well, in a way, like when it comes to the floating office itself, the amount of PV panels on top, you're talking about an area of basically let's say 11 by 70 or 80 meters, so it's like 880 meters of PV panels on one half. They provide enough energy to power the building itself, but also surplus of that. I think because of somehow the connection to the municipal networks have not been made there yet. It will take a little longer, obviously, because the whole Rijnhaven is changing. So to be able to hook it up to the side and to be able to really make sure that it provides also locally some electricity for the surroundings, that solution is not there yet. But I do believe that the building as a statement kind of make sure that the urgency or the ambition to make sure that we place these kind of networks is put to the foreground as the potential that it has. When it comes to the master plan, I think that's a very big question. It's something that it's not, you could not answer yet. Let's say the master plan, you should see more as a sort of framework. I showed a very detailed master plan in the sense that everything looks as if it's completely designed, but it remains a master plan and a vision for the whole area. And in this vision, a lot of parties are going to be playing a role. So it's going to be developers, it's going to be the municipality, it's going to be, they're going to put a whole park in the Rijnhaven, so they're going to cover it again and put a park with a beach there. So there's all kind of things going to be happening in the coming years that to some degree will be dealing with the water and with the climate. And I think this whole Rijnhaven as an experiment will make sure that these ambitions are being somehow put on the horizon, but I cannot at this moment give you the right an answer yet on how that will happen, technically speaking, and whether all the projects around it will be making use of the latest technology. So that's a little bit hard to answer. And then the last question regarding the wood. I mean, maybe in the pictures it's not completely clear. So we felt a bit hesitant about showing really the wood in its sort of brownish color. First of all, as I mentioned, a majority of the structure is made in cross-laminated timber. So if it were like pure logs, then of course it would be a different question. Then maybe it's much more attractive, but cross-laminated timber is not necessarily the most, in my eyes, or in our eyes as Powerhouse, also not the most attractive timber. Also the color sometimes makes it feel a bit yellowish, and what we decided to do therefore is to gray wash it, as I said, but the gray wash retains a certain transparency in it, so it basically sort of neutralizes somehow the yellowish color that we just didn't like very much aesthetically, but still you would see the wood behind it. So there is transparency, and there's definitely, when you're on the building site, I mean, I'll try to find a picture in which you can see it, but definitely you still in the beams you still definitely see the wood as a material. It's just less yellow, basically.
Okay. The next question says, you mentioned that symmetry was really important as the building is floating. Where there are other structural measurements taken to make sure the building would not tip over or break due to imbalance by the users?
By the users. Well, there are plenty of jokes made by like, yeah, we have to make sure that we all are sitting on both sides equally. Otherwise the building will start tipping. Well, I mean, we are not as heavy. So you will not have it will not have a consequence for the tipping. What I can say regarding the tipping, though, is that it is quite a precise calculation that has to be made. So let me go back to that image. Basically, on one side we have let's see, first image. Yeah, so on one side we have a sedum roof, as you can see here. So on the water, the K side, you have the sedum roof, and on the other side you have a solar panel roof, and there is indeed a difference in weight there. We didn't want to have the solar panels on the K side for the reason of, you know, it's a public space, people walk there, and there's going to be this floating boulevard there, so it would fit much more with the atmosphere of green, and it also helps with retaining water. And then obviously the solar panels on the north side are much less efficient anyway than on the south side. So that's why we had this difference, but you notice that this difference immediately has an impact on how it's floating. So basically the way it's counteracted is that on the south side of the building, we have this sort of terrace with steps coming down, and the steps are hanging off the concrete structure, the concrete, yeah, you cannot see it here, sadly. Yeah, okay, well, you can see it here a little bit. So basically they're hanging off the concrete basin, the concrete foundation, and that hanging counteracts the weight of the grass or the greenery on the other side. So in that sense, you do have to do it in a smart and intelligent way. So momentarily, basically, the roof is ready. So the PV panels are light, and now the stairs are not yet in place. So basically, the building is slanting. Let's say from left to right, it's slanting by 6 centimeters, which is, let's say, 3 inches. It's funny that you don't really notice it when you're there, but you do see it. You do see sort of the water line is a bit slanted. And of course, that's going to be it's going to be horizontal the moment that the stairs is placed, but that's not yet currently the case.
Okay, thank you. That was the last question. I'm gonna pass it to Cristina now.
All right. All right. Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you, Albert. I think that we can end on this fantastic note, and I hope that the relevant information will be used by our students also in their design.
Yeah, I'm curious. And I think you mentioned at the very beginning that if you have further questions, I mean, don't email us, but we do have a website in which, like if you go to the For Office link, if you scroll all the way down, you'll have a sort of Q&A section. So if you have like specific questions that you still want to ask, then feel free to do it under our sort of discussion panel that is on the project page.
That is a great opportunity, I think. And yeah. Albert, would you mind putting, kindly share your presentation last slide for a moment?
Yeah, let me
thank you.
All the way there. This one, yeah.
All right, so thank you everybody for your,
No, the link was also here, sorry. I scrolled all the way up, but the link was also right there. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for your patience, and I really hope that this lecture inspires you as much as it inspired me. And to make sure that Albert gets home before the curfew starts, right? We will have to start.
30 minutes. It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. Rotterdam is the center is quite small, as I showed. It's the harbor that is huge, but the center is tiny.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for everybody for attending this lecture. And please remember that we are continuing our sessions on March 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time and 7 p.m. Central Time, Europe. We will propose a speaker from Madaster about material passport. And on the 17th of March at the same time, there are speakers from Metabolics about applying circular economy principles to the built environment and urban mining. We are announcing them all on the Baltimore-Rotterdam Committee social media, and an email announcement will be sent to everybody who registers on Eventbrite. Please also note that the recording of this lecture will be available via the Baltimore-Rotterdam Committee YouTube channel later on in the week. And once available, we will also communicate this to all attendees of today's session. Once again, thank you very much, Albert and Powerhouse Company, for your talk.
Thank you so much. It's been great, and it's nice to share these exciting projects with everybody. So thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening or good night to everybody who attended, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. Good evening.